Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, and welcome everyone to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Our guest today is Stuart Itkin. I do want to remind everyone that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations seeking certification under CMMC, and that's who's mostly in our audience today. If you're listening in and you have some questions for Stuart as we go through the next half hour, please send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work in questions as time permits. I'll start with introduction of Stuart. Stuart Itkin is Vice President of CMMC and FedRAMP Assurance at Coalfire Federal. His background is in marketing and product development, specifically in the cybersecurity space. He previously worked at ExoStar and SAIFE. He's also a mentor with the Mach 37 Cyber Accelerator. Coalfire Federal is already the largest player in the FedRAMP 3PAO space, having done more assessments than anybody. And Stuart looks to lead them down the C3PAO path as they move to support CMMC. Thanks for joining us today, Stuart.
Well, Ed, thank you very much for inviting me.
So it's definitely a big deal now that we've trained some CMMC assessors. Companies like yours are on the brink of becoming C3PAOs or getting that official status. And I say brink, I don't know, maybe you have that status. I don't know if it's been awarded yet, but I know there's kind of one step left is what we heard
right.
From the AB. One of the big questions around CMMC has been the details of the assessment process and what we can expect once the audits get started. So we'll definitely talk about some of that today. But before we dive into the sort of C3PAO side of things and assessment specifics, I want to ask a question drawing on your background in market development. One of the big challenges with CMMC, getting it rolled out to 300,000 members of the defense industrial base, is just rapidly expanding the ecosystem, the availability of services and service providers and tools and things that people need. A 5-year rollout is pretty quick, and it's going to take a lot of people. So my question is, as you watched CMMC emerge on the scene over the past year and a half, what have been your observations on how industry has mobilized to make this happen? Are there some innovations in terms of services and approaches that have kind of caught your eye?
I think it's a great question, a great starting point. And I think for context, this is happening a lot faster than people recognized and realized up front. We all have seen the projections that the government put forward with respect to roll out a few this year, more next year, and not until the later years where we see the volume. But organizations really are getting in line now for a number of reasons. I mean, one is education, programs like this that are encouraging organizations to go through the process and get ready to be certified. Yes, second, there are those that truly understand this as a security initiative, in that their organizations benefit from being able to achieve a level of cyber maturity. And finally, there are several that are looking at this from the standpoint of competitive advantage. They know the contractors that they work with, assess the risk associated with individuals they bring onto a bid, and feel that by being CMMC certified early, they make themselves more attractive to those that they want to do business with. A second component of this is the realization that cost is important. A lot of people seem to be focusing on, what is the cost of the assessment? And the assessment, truth be told, is probably the smallest cost component that an organization needs to go through. It's really the cost of getting ready, understanding where they are today relative to being able to achieve the required level of cyber maturity and the things that they need to put in place to be able to get there. I mean, the good news is that there are a number of innovations and people that are focused on that, organizations that are focusing on tools to help companies get ready, from those offering kind of DIY assessment tools to reduce the burden or the dependency on outside third parties, to those that are providing educational resources. Ultimately, I think we'll see automated tools to be able to move the assessments along, to be able to check configurations, to check compliance with specific requirements that may exist. And I think the final way that we're seeing innovation is in some of the offerings that are being brought to market that will help organizations achieve the requisite level of cyber maturity. From organizations that are specifically developing solutions to for example, to address the requirements for FIPS encryption and secure email as a solution, to organizations that are simply creating secure environments or MSP type environments for an organization to be able to move into. And I think we'll continue to see more creative ways that companies see to be able to support the DIB in meeting its requirements to achieve CMMC certification.
I agree. I think there's been a tremendous amount of innovation in both the way people are taking this as organizations thinking about how they might achieve it, and the organizations that are bringing stuff to market and saying, hey, this is a helpful tool or a helpful approach. So I think it's been pretty phenomenal, honestly, what's happened in about a 1 year period of time. You mentioned competitive advantage, and that's something that we see a lot. I mean, I think that's sort of the folks that are on this call, the folks that are engaging with us as a service provider early in the process are by definition the early adopters. And so they're the ones who see, that as a competitive advantage. So I think it's a little bit of the people I end up talking to sort of self-select to that crowd, right?
Sure.
That's why we're engaged in a conversation. So maybe I have inflated perspective of what percentage of the DIB it is, but it seems like a lot. It seems like that's a big deal. And the number one question from those folks is, when can we get it done, right? So these are companies that have made the investment. They want to have their certification as soon as possible. In other words, they feel they've already built the competitive advantage. They want to get the stamp of approval. So what's the timeline for that? Where specifically with Coalfire, where are you guys in the C3PAO process? And when do you expect you'll be fielding some assessment teams to do certification assessments?
Yeah, so we're very much involved in the process, and as you mentioned in the introduction, very much determined to have a similar position as we've been able to establish in FedRAMP. We've had people who have gone through the process, and of the 98 provisional assessors, we've had one that went through the first class and passed the certification, another that was in the third class, and we have a number of others that are queued up to go through the next class that the AB will be having. We were also among the first organizations listed or authorized by the accreditation body as a C3PAO. And like others, as you said, there is one more hurdle of being able to go through our own CMMC assessment. And we expect, as the guidance has been coming from the PMO and from the AB, that we expect to be, again, near the front of that line, if not at the front of that line, when assessments start to begin. Now roughly June timeframe is what we're being told. Again, this is a learning process for everybody. Nobody has done this before, and so as DIBCAC has gone through this or is going through this, I'm sure that there's learning that they have in how to conduct these assessments for the C3PAOs, let alone the CP3AOs, learning how to do these assessments for organizations seeking certification.
So once you get past those hurdles, how will you prioritize? And I think the story that you told in terms of the number of provisional assessors, that was a really small program, highly competitive, meaning a lot of people applied and not everybody got in. So most organizations have one or two people. That doesn't make for a really robust delivery team, right? So,
right.
So they're going to be in short supply until some of the things we heard about last week on this program. We heard from the AB about some of the things they're doing to roll that out sort of en masse, right? To be able to generate large numbers of trained certified assessors. But that's still a ways out. It's still a few months out. So when you're still in that scarcity situation with limited assessors, not just you, but all of the C3PAOs will be limited in that way. How will you prioritize? Is it going to be first come, first serve? Is there priority for companies that are involved in contracts that the DoD has designated as CMMC? I mean, there it's a requirement. So those companies will need to get certified. For others, it's more the competitive advantage. How will you sort that out?
So again, it's a great question. We've gone back to the accreditation body asking for guidance relative to those organizations involved in the pilot programs that have been announced and how those are going to be assigned, or how do they get in line. And we've not received any specific guidance at that point other than being told it's a good question. And so I'm not sure that the AB has the specific answer to it at this point. I can tell you that we've had a number of organizations that have come to us already for assessments and wanting to ensure that they're kind of early in the process, that they want to be first. So, we've looked at those on a first come, first served basis and have already booked a backlog of organizations to go through assessments at a variety of levels. And when I say that, we've had some that have come and said, we want to be first at number 5 or level 5, which hasn't been defined yet. So right now, we're building that backlog and continuing as organizations come to us, but we expect that we will get some guidance from the accreditation body with respect to those organizations that are part of the pilot program.
So I have an audience question that is trying to sort out the timing, and you have given some of these dates already, but the comment is there's a conflict in terms of timing of the C3PAO's readiness. We initially heard late summer, early fall. Some vendors are saying May, June. Can you provide clarity? So is May, June realistic? Is it going to be possible to do assessments in May, June? Earlier comments, it sounded like it was a little later than that.
So I think we're waiting on the same information and same steps that others are, and relying on a lot of the same information that you're hearing. I think early summer, which has been the guidance that we've heard most recently, and from what we see occurring, seems to be what is realistic at this point.
Got it. Thanks. Want to think about the process of passing the audit, right? So as a service provider, NeoSystems, we're in the business of passing audits on behalf of our clients. We take all our clients through a successful audit. For many of in the audience today, they're working towards this as the first type of external scrutiny on their cybersecurity program. So the process is new for all of us, and I realize I'm asking you a question about a process that you haven't performed yet. So, but from your perspective, having looked at this from a C3PAO perspective, what can we all expect from the assessment? How are they going to be carried out? What kind of level of knowledge, experience, training, et cetera, should we expect from the assessors? And that sort of on the ground experience, how do you see that coming to be?
Yeah, and so I think first the perspective is that this is a 100% conformance standard that that needs to be met. It's not one like others like FedRAMP or 800-171 where somebody can satisfy it with a POAM. And so organizations coming into the assessment process need to have a high degree of assurance that they've truly satisfied all of those practice requirements. And the role of the assessor, again, is not to provide feedback, but rather simply to be able to provide pass-fail information back to the organization that is seeking certification. And so, what do organizations need to do, especially those that have not gone through other sorts of compliance engagements like this before? First, we recommend they go through a readiness assessment. This is something that can be conducted by a C3PAO because it's not a conflict, or it can be conducted by another organization. The C3PAO has the benefit of being able to tell an organization, this is what you need to have ready to be able to go through the assessment process. And the readiness review will tell an organization, here's who needs to participate. This is the documentation or the evidence that you need to have available. This is how the assessment process is going to go forward, and to help that organization gauge whether in fact they truly are ready in terms of the information that they have. It's not grading what they've done, but simply saying, do you have all of this available? Second thing we recommend to an organization is go through a practice test. That there is a certain remediation period that you have for items that have been found by a certified assessor by the C3PAO. And if it happens that any of those items are significant and can't be fixed within that remediation period, then the assessment needs to be started again from the beginning. And what we're recommending to a lot of organizations, kind of like you did when you took the SAT or the ACT going into college, take a practice test, understand, where you're at, if there are any things that you haven't mastered. And if you find that there are gaps at that point in time, take the time that you need to ensure that they've been remediated before you go through the formal assessment process. Then the role of the C3PAO is to simply go through the process practice by practice. And they have the opportunity to ask you to look at any control from 2 of 3 perspectives. They can examine, they can interview, or they can observe, and we'll generally pick 2 of those 3. And for example, control under access control, or requirement under access control, is timeout in implementation of a screensaver. And part of the assessment may be where they'll interview your CISO or the appropriate person and say, do you have a screensaver? Yes. What's the time period during which that screensaver will be activated? Could be 15 minutes. They'll say, great, I've interviewed you. Now, let me examine, show me your policy and where it is written that it says that. And the third thing they may do is to say, okay, great, you've said 15 minutes, you've had it here in the policy, let's sit here and wait 15 minutes and see it happens and observe it. And that's kind of the process that the assessor will go through on each of the practices, is to be able to, to look and choose 2 of those 3 methods to be able to verify that in fact you've satisfied each of those practices.
That's good. That's good advice. I think, one of the things that we talk a lot about in our solutions as a managed service provider is making sure that we've designed things to be audited, right? And I think that's somewhat new. A lot of folks have designed in the past, prior to CMMC, they designed things to be effective for their organization, and they thought more about, the threat and do I have confidence that the security thing that I just paid for is working? But now I need to add in the maturity aspect of, can we reliably demonstrate this to an auditor whenever they walk in the door? So that's good to think through as you're describing how that works.
Exactly.
An audience question that talks about, you made a comment about the readiness assessment is not a conflict. So can you confirm that the C3PAO, the same C3PAO, can conduct a readiness assessment and the certification audit for a particular client, as long as they don't give any consulting, right?
Exactly. And in fact, the same C3PAO can do the readiness assessment, simply come in and tell you, this is what you need to have prepared and ready before you come into the assessment. The same C3PAO can do the mock assessment, which for all intents and purposes is the same process. The only difference is that the results don't get reported to the accreditation body. Simply the organization is informed which, if any, of those practice requirements that they fail to satisfy. So AC3PAO can do all 3 of those, but again, there's no advice that comes out of it. C3PAO can't complete the mock assessment and say, you failed this, what you need to do is, or here's what is missing. It's simply being able to tell them, in the same way you would take a practice ACT test, you passed or you failed.
That's good distinction there. Just a logistic question the audience members asking is, how do you register for an audit? So we talked about timing. What's if you say, hey, I'm ready, what's the process? Is there a registration process, or do you just contract with a provider to do that?
So all of the C3PAOs are listed on the accreditation body marketplace, and it's up to the organization seeking certification to be able to seek the C3PAO that they choose to work with, and then contract directly with that organization. And there could be a lot of considerations for why they choose a particular C3PAO. Price is always one, and there's always going to be people that are price conscious, but there is sometimes distinction in the expertise of an individual C3PAO. Again, the environments DIB organizations have, they're all different. They're pretty complex, and an organization that perhaps has deep expertise in assessing the Microsoft suite, or a C3PAO who has experience working with a particular managed service provider's controls so that they're familiar with that environment can not only facilitate the assessment, but sometimes it could reduce the time that may be involved in it. The assessor knows what to look at because they've been working with others that have used that same managed service provider as an example.
And that's something we're working a lot on at NeoSystems. As I mentioned, we have to get all of our clients through audits, so we want to make sure that that's a smooth track, right, for us to get our clients through there. So spend a lot of time on exactly what you just mentioned, and making sure that we know, that the things that we're doing are going to pass. I've got an audience question that just to kind of clarify something you mentioned a minute ago about the consulting content and how that affects independence. The question is, if an auditor gives a pass-fail response to a certain control, will there be any other information provided? Do they plan on giving guidance on where the company is lacking or how to get 100% compliant for the failing controls?
So from the C3PAO, all the C3PAO can indicate is whether you've passed or failed. And obviously, to be able to pass, you need to be able to satisfy any that were fails to get there. And that really becomes the role of an advisory services firm, to work with an organization, almost from the beginning of the process, to help them understand where is CUI in their environment, what is the boundary, potentially to help them understand how do they attenuate that boundary to reduce what is in scope for CMMC, to help them go through a gap assessment to identify what is the delta between their current state and their ability to satisfy, or what they need to do to satisfy CMMC requirements, and what's the strategy then to remediate those. And that's generally what an advisory services partner would do. That can be an RPO organization, but it doesn't necessarily need to be an RPO. An RPO is not a required distinction to be able to provide advisory services for CMMC.
Thank you. I've got a couple other audience questions that frankly are better than the questions I had prepared. So I'm gonna use those, and then maybe a couple more of those, and then I'm gonna fly up a little higher level beyond. Okay. We've been in sort of the technical weeds, so we'll fly up near the end here. This question says, you talk about showing an auditor that we satisfy a control, but then you mentioned maturity. What are the requirements and expectations for showing maturity? Do we have to prove that our policies and procedures have been satisfied and improved over time?
So the short answer is yes. A lot of people ask specifically, well, how much evidence do I need to provide? Do I need 6 months? Do I need 3 months? And the guidance has been left to the discretion of the assessor to be able to establish in their judgment that the organization has achieved maturity, that they have developed and implemented the control, they're following it, they're using it, and that it's proving to be effective. What they don't want, and the guidance to the assessors is, we don't want somebody who literally the night before finished writing a policy, the ink isn't quite dry, to show up for an assessment and say, here's our documentation that proves we satisfy this, when they've not been practicing that. So it's really from the judgment of the assessor in terms of what is sufficient to be able to demonstrate that an organization is not just talking the talk, but it's walking the walk.
Got a question here about RPO advisory, and it says, not sure how an RPO can advise you if they can't tell you what you failed on. So I think you were kind of going down the path of what the C3PAO can do and what an RPO or a consulting advisor could do. Just to make sure we're clear, the C3PAO can tell you what you passed and failed on in an authoritative way, but they can't tell you how to fix it. The RPO, or someone who's in a consulting arrangement, can tell you how to fix things, but they can't do the other thing, right? They can't tell you if you pass or fail in an authoritative way. Do I have that right?
So I think said much more clearly than I did. Absolutely. The C3PAO can say you failed. The requirements to have passed this practice are this, this, and this. You did not satisfy this part of the practice control. In terms of what do I need to do to be able to satisfy it? That's the question that the C3PAO cannot answer, but that's what an RPO or an advisory service partner can answer for a client or for an organization seeking certification.
Thank you for circling back on that one. So let's fly up. Like I say, this has been a really good discussion of some of the nitty gritty of how this assessment process works. And as we can tell by these questions, mine and the audience questions, there's a lot of details people are eager to know. And I know we're like I say, we're stretching it a little because there's not experience any of us have to fall back on. So it's good to think through it and make sure that we're preparing in the right way. But let's fly up a little bit. In this series, we are really in the CMMC topic. But the past few weeks, we've had some really good guests on that have brought a much broader view on some of the asymmetric threats that we're facing, and really put what we're doing around the DIB and CMMC into that broader context. Please, share with us kind of your perspective on how you see CMMC fitting into the larger picture of supply chain risk, national cyber posture, national security in general. So complementary to CMMC, what are some things that need to happen elsewhere inside of government, inside the commercial sector, the DIB, the commercial sector that's not the DIB, that's going to shift the balance from a national security perspective?
So I think rather than thinking outside CMMC, I'd rather kind of go back to the original thinking of CMMC. And when we all started down this journey, about 2 years ago for CMMC, the talk was about cyber maturity. The talk was, don't use a compliance lens. In fact, it's one of the reasons that 800-171 wasn't successful. When I look at compliance, I choose the cheapest alternative that enables me to check a box. Think about security, use a risk lens, not a compliance lens. We talked about the security of the DoD supply chain. And we also kind of mentioned to people, by the way, the information that's getting stolen that is ultimately affecting the DoD, it's your information that you've invested in. And over probably the last maybe half year, what I've seen in our conversations with clients, it's kind of devolved back to looking at this from a compliance standpoint. And if this is truly going to be successful, we need to kind of elevate the awareness back to thinking through a risk lens and thinking about the decisions that you make from a risk lens. When we talk to, again, a smaller, less technically sophisticated client about multi-factor authentication, it's not about starting the conversation, here's what you need to do, but let me explain to you why you need multi-factor authentication. If somebody's credentials are stolen, if they're able to get into your network, this protects you from that. It makes the reason and the reason to invest, I think, simply more clear to that individual. So, what can we do? I think we need to change the conversation back to one about cyber maturity rather than simply how do I comply and satisfy CMMC, and how do I look at this from the standpoint of risk, and what is the level of risk that I'm truly accepting? What is the risk that I want to eliminate that exists within my organization?
It kind of comes down to the difference between security and compliance, right? You can have one without the other, or if you're careful and you're doing it well, you can have both of those things.
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But you can't have just compliance.
You can.
You can't.
You might not like the outcome.
Well, and that's probably, we've had just compliance, which is why we now are going to have CMMC.
Very good. We just have a minute or two left, so I want to ask a wrap-up question. Always like to ask about ways we can get better results, more bang for our buck, if you will. What's your number one suggestion for the companies on our program today to ensure first-time audit success? What should they be doing now to make sure that when they bring in an auditor to do the certification assessment, that's successful first time through?
So I think there's three things that that they need to do as an organization. One, again, recognize this is 100% conformance standard. The requirements are very exacting. Choose a partner and be careful in choosing a partner who truly does have the understanding of the practice requirements, how they're going to be interpreted, and what you need to do to achieve cyber maturity, not simply check the box. Second, it's about being able to set realistic expectations for an organization. We've walked into companies, and when we've conferred with them about what needs to be done, we feel like we're in the position of being the messenger that is getting shot, because organizations aren't prepared for the extent or the investment and commitment that is required. So, having realistic expectations is important. And then finally, this is a process. It's not a one and done. Start early to ensure that you're able to achieve cyber maturity ahead of when you need to achieve CMMC certification. And if you get there early, all you've done is made your own organization safer and more secure.
Stuart, thanks. There was really good wrap up. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank the audience for your time today. I want to thank Wade Forbes, our artist. You can see on the screen is capturing what we're doing in real time, and we'll send that out to the attendees so you can help jog your memory of some of the things that Stuart brought to our attention today. This is a really good conversation, Stuart. Thanks very much. Want to invite people to our future town hall meetings. Our next session is going to be Wednesday, March 31st at 1 p.m., our usual time. We'll have the large prime perspective. We're going to have Alicia Lynch, who's CISO of SAIC, looking at how she's handling CMMC and supply chain risk management. Alicia was recently named one of the top 10 CISOs to watch by Washington Exec Magazine. So congratulations to her on that. And we're really looking forward to having a chance to speak with her. Stuart, thanks very much.
Ed, thank you very much for inviting me.